doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
But I think no one knows those transactions better than one of our own export credit agencies, the African Trade Insurance Agency, that I think by number of countries is probably the most Pan-African trade insurance agency that we have. So Deepak, I'd like you to just share your views on what you've heard and where you see the very specific opportunities are between the trade banks, the ECAs, and institutional investors to be able to support commercially viable African continental free trade area related transactions. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Hubert. I think some of the speakers before me have done a fantastic job of talking about how ECA cover works. So what remains for me is perhaps to talk a little bit about the transactions we see at the Africa Trade Insurance Agency. A little bit of context is that we are an A-rated agency by S&P and Moody's, owned by 19 African governments and several developed or middle-income country ECAs from Asia, Europe, and hopefully North America soon. Given our rating is actually higher than a lot of our own shareholders, what that enables us to do in conjunction with our preferred creditor status in country is to get involved in transactions that have an edgier aspect to them. So certainly one of the things, one sector that we are seeing growing rapidly is of course infrastructure, whether it's to do with trade and transport in the form of us having finance cargo airliners. We currently are looking at transactions that have to do with build-outs of warehousing, food safety and supply, and port logistics facilities. We're on the cards to deal with transactions to do with cross-border water and power supply. We also happen to manage two funds for KfW and the European Investment Bank that have to do with renewable energy infrastructure guarantees and for payment guarantees from local utilities. These are pretty much the bread and butter of what ECAs do, and we do it extremely well. And with a rating like ours, it allows us to leverage our capital up to the level where we finance something, where we're involved with financing close to $6.5 billion worth of deals on the continent. A separate area that I think most people aren't often aware of is that we also provide insurance for, as I said earlier, edgier products in the capital markets. So we provided credit wraps and credit enhancement for capital markets issuances by sovereigns or by sovereign-owned utilities. And we have actively looked at transactions involving the packaging of trade finance receivables into securitizable assets or tradable packages of loans. These have unfortunately continued to fall away, not for any lack of effort, I think, on a number of people's parts, but often due to local regulation or perhaps just, frankly, deal fatigue at some point. However, we continue to look for sponsors who are willing to stay the course and see these deals through, because the capital markets work we've done so far tells us that there's a lot of firepower that we bring to the table when it comes to well-structured, tradable or easily financeable transactions that can be monetized at difficult times without complex processes. Our shareholding also enables an ECA like ours on the ground to, in fact, often co-invest with foreign ECAs that may want us to front the transaction or to partner with them, precisely because we have links into very high levels at government, where our preferred creditor status not just gives us legal access, but it also gives us the moral standing to be able to approach our member countries at difficult times. A prominent Southern African country that's facing some debt rescheduling issues at the moment, for example, has recently worked very closely with us in helping to reprofile debts that would otherwise have ended up on the front pages of a bunch of newspapers. Instead, we were able to manage the situation quite well because we had the standing to have that conversation, not just with them, but also the reputation to be able to deal with foreign reinsurance and credit enhancement markets as well. So there's a few areas in which I think a number of people on this call have talked about that we could work with, and our doors are always open, and of course our emails are pretty much always working. So we look forward to working with people on this call, but also with other investor bases on transactions in the future. Thank you, Hubert.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and it's good to know that you're already doing a lot of this. I mean, we had a long engagement this week with a number of our infrastructure funds, and they were just trying to identify new ways to be able to originate transactions and crowd in funding. And they were aware of this type of instrument, but they were not aware that the liquidity pool could potentially come from us as asset owners, because that's not how it's traditionally been done on the continent. So I think with Wamkele and African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, a number of us on this call could really make a difference here.
Of course. Hubert, one area that I'm sorry, I should have really mentioned is that it surprises us that private equity funds, for example, don't approach us more often for political risk or non-payment cover, because a lot of private equity transactions on the continent are actually private debt transactions, perhaps with a mezzanine component, and are often dependent on cash flows from particular investments or utility payments. And this is an area we could often work quite closely with them, but we're often surprised by how surprised they are when they hear about us, because they say, had we but known, a number of transactions we've turned down in the past would have looked so much more bankable if we'd been able to work with someone like you. And that's an area which I confess as an ECA we haven't thought about ourselves hitting on very hard. But certainly with some of the exceptional cast of characters on this call, we'd be delighted to liaise more with any bodies that can work with groups of investors like that as well.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.